Good afternoon, colleagues. Please take your seats and warm welcome to this panel. I'm Renaud Seligman. I'm the Director for Strategy and Operations in the Sustainable Development Vice Presidency of the World Bank. Very, very pleased to welcome a distinguished panel this afternoon to talk about how we can scale up our interventions for greater impact in situations where we have weak public institutions. What is the role of development institutions in that context? And it's a context where, when it rains, it pours. Not only do you have about 60% of the world's poor living in fragile and conflict-affected settings, but you have compounding effects of different shocks and different trends. Climate change, which is overlaying with severe food insecurity. 240 million people are estimated to be affected by severe food insecurity by 2027, but it will be twice as prevalent in FCV affected countries, in countries that are affected by fragility, conflict, and violence. The other side is also true in that 80% of the world's major armed conflicts between 1980 and 2000 occurred in biodiversity hotspots, in places where there's a huge amount of biodiversity. And research has found that at least 40% of all intrastate conflicts were either started, funded, or prolonged by natural resources and the natural resource curse. So you see that there is a closely intertwined set of challenges that are mutually reinforcing. And climate change sits at the heart of it. Its impact is already seen and felt by many of our client countries. It's not a tomorrow problem, it's a today problem. Water scarcity somewhere, crop failure somewhere else, floods, and food insecurity, economic shocks that come from that, migration and displacement, all of that are stressors that when they come on top of fault lines that exist in society, aggravate the risks of conflict. It's like an accelerator on the tinder of the fire of conflict, and it risks creating a fragility trap, a vicious cycle that we really need to try and break. And so if we talk about a livable planet, we're talking about the interconnections of all these ecosystems, water security, climate, nature, biodiversity, food and agriculture, but also cities and the people that live in those places. And so the question for us is, how can we make the planet livable for everyone? How can we break that cycle, particularly in those places that are suffering from fragility, conflict, and violence? So we have a distinguished panel here to talk about it today. To my left, Ms. Fatia Alwan, who is the Director for Health and Social Development at the Intergovernmental Authority for Development. Welcome. Minister Kenya Bale, who is the Minister of Planning and Economic Development of Sierra Leone. Excellency, welcome. We have our own Susan Wong, Lead Social Development Specialist, working on South Asia, as well as many global issues at the World Bank. And we have Harry, Senior Environmental Engineer, who works in the Middle East and North Africa region at the World Bank, as well as online, Stéphane Gambert, who is the country director for Egypt, Yemen, and Djibouti, based in Cairo, and who has kindly agreed to stay up late in Egypt to be part of this conversation. So let me start with you, Ms. Alwan. I was talking about the impact of climate on our client countries, and the Horn of Africa is really at the forefront of that impact. IGAD takes a regional approach to try and mitigate these effects, to try and tackle those events, to avoid them turning into a source of war, insecurity, and to help continue on the path towards prosperity. So how is that working out? Please, over to you.
Thank you, Director, and also good afternoon to all the participants. My name is Fatih Alwan. Actually, I'm from the region, of course, originally from Djibouti, but also, of course, I have roots with all the 7 member states. Maybe just also to put you in the context of this commodity, this of the fragility. I think first maybe it's important to know that our region, we have 8 countries, Djibouti, Eritrea, though also they have suspended their membership, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and also Uganda. As you all know, also our region, actually the Horn of Africa, has always been recognized as one of the most fragile, of the continent. We know that, of course, we have several actually conflicts which are going on. Of course, it could be inter or intra-conflict, but also, as you have rightly raised, the issue of the climate change. Maybe also to put also in the context, of course, the audience is that when IGAD has been created in 1986, actually the mandate of the IGAD was with a double D to combat the drought and desertification, because already the leaders actually they knew that it's so important that, after the several famine that has been taken, in the region, that we needed to have a strong common institution who can actually address the issue of drought desertification. But 10 years later also, they have realized, of course, we have not only drought desertification, but also we have the issue of conflict. Conflict because of the scarcity of, as you have said, of water, but also, the food, the insecurity. And also, we have also several problems, which is going on, the mobility, because we should not forget when you have actually a climate change and also a conflict, you have also a important use of influence of people who are always moving around the borders within, but also across the borders.
Right.
And this is what's also when they come actually to have an IGAD with D1D, means now maybe we need to shift it from the desertification, but also to the development. You see that already, the shifting has taken place. And again, also, they thought that, of course, what is important, we have 7 countries, how also we are all working together to address also the regional integration agenda. Of course, all are these aligned with the different policies of the African Union. But still, after 38 years, still we can see the issue of are also remaining. Conflict is always there. We have also this issue of famine. If our region, they have almost 50 million out of 350 million, which are really in food insecurity. Our region also is one of the regions also which is hosting a large number of IDPs. It might be close to 20 million. And out of this also population, we might also have, according to the UNHCR figures, 4.5 to 5 million of refugees. Coupled also with, of course, the migrants who are also crossing for better opportunity. All this actually has posed to our government how best actually they can address all this issue. What could be actually how they can also respond to all these needs. And this is why also has the IGAD been an intergovernmental authority on development, where also we are representing we are complementing their efforts, because it's so important to know that we are a regional institution.
Yes.
And as a regional institution, we need to make sure how we are working member state, and how are we duplicating what they are doing, or are we adding value? And this is actually how that, as the IGAD, our main efforts was how we address all this issue of the migration, the displacement, the people, because at the end, whether we have actually a stronger policy on food security, on waters, but at the end is the lives of the people. And this is why also, we have as the IGAD, we have also come up with several policy strategies, where also we have brought actually the country together to also develop common framework, common policies, common actions that also could brought to the community down level, And also the other also the point is that IGAD, of course, is as I say, we are an intergovernmental authority on development. We have just also attended in Geneva last time what we call the Global Refugee Forum, whereas the IGAD we have actually played a big role. We have been also able to launch what we call the IGAD support platform, how we can work with member states, because it's still the refugees remain actually a big issue for our countries. And this is why, if we have the issue of Somalia still, which is going on. We have Sudan, which have been a strong country. We have been just a few months ago the chair of IGAD, but now is also part, of this fragile, country.
Yeah.
I think has an international community, and also for us, we know that our mandate is very clear. We need also to support our member state, how they can deliver the mandate. But what is important is also how the partners like the multilateral organization, whether it's the World Bank, European Union, FDB, they can also support the regions to capacitate actually because when I've seen scaling up the greaters through weaker public institution, definitely to capacitate, and also how we can also together deliver our regional program. Of course, our regional program is aligned what the country are doing, but most important is also, of course, saving the lives, having a common framework. Yesterday, also the morning, we were listening actually, of course, the World Bank Director Operation, and she said that it's very important that we need to be engaged.
Stay engaged.
Yes, stay engaged.
Yeah.
I think it's very important because what you have seen just recently in Sudan, where, have all these institutions, when the war has exploded, all the institutions have left.
Yeah.
I think this is really a reality. And this is why now, as regional institution, we have been requested to step in. But what we can do, if we don't have all the means, I think it's so important. I think, maybe the world also to understand what the role the regional economic community are playing, because at the end also we are there back,
right,
to support them. I will not also talk to take too much, but what I will say is that yes, actually, we have raised the issue of the political instability, but also it's so important also that we need more be engaged, building the capacity of this vulnerable population, which is also at the borders, and I think this is what we can rightly say for now, but really once again thanks so much for giving us the opportunity, and this is also what we want to share actually.
Thank you so much, and thank you for what you do in what is a very vulnerable part of the world. I remember a decade ago we were engaged in building public financial management systems in Somalia to try and pay civil servants and to try and develop capacity locally. And 10 years on, it's actually helped a lot, and we were able to remain engaged even when the conflict was happening. And actually, Stefan, who will speak later, is overseeing our operation in Yemen, where we are also doing our best to remain engaged with partners on the ground. So, Minister, Sierra Leone wants to accelerate and transform its development trajectory, right? And you've known war in the past, and you also are one of those places where those issues all come together: climate, food security, water, nature, social inclusion. Where do you start? When you're developing your development strategy, what are your priorities? What are your key entry points? Over to you.
Okay, many thanks for the question and the invite. This is the, I think, fourth panel that I'm participating in today.
So you can be brief.
No. Listen, I haven't. It's the fourth panel, and in one fell swoop, you asked me the hardest and the easiest question. The easiest, because I just have to describe our medium-term development plan, which we just launched on the 30th of January, under a month ago. So it's fresh on my mind. Hardest, because I have to do it in 5 minutes. But I will try. Yes, you did talk about the accelerated agenda, and that's the actual subtitle of our medium-term national development plan, 2024 to 2030. It's a 7-year plan, which is a deviation from all previous plans that have been for 5 years. And the reason for this is that we had wanted to align it to the SDG agenda, the endpoint, 2030. And well, it's also aligned with, because we had developed an accelerator roadmap. So it's also aligned with other global agendas, such as the Vision 2030 for ECOWAS and also AU 2063. And the subtitle of the plan is an accelerated transformative agenda for food security, human capital development, and job creation. So that covers all of the areas that you mentioned. And we did in prioritizing, we did sequencing and prioritizing of the plan's goals and objectives and interventions because of the limited resources.
Right.
So based on the president's manifesto pronouncements, we actually have a plan that focuses on 5 key areas. And these we call the 5 game changers. Mm-hmm. And these 5 changes are Feed Sierra Leone in the local parlance. So it's Feed Sierra Leone. Feed Sierra Leone, human capital development, which was the flagship program of our previous plan. Feed Sierra Leone is the flagship program of the current plan.
Right.
Youth employment. And this is the youth employment scheme. And this is the only the only game changer that actually has a target, which is the provision of 500,000 jobs. Yeah. And then we have technology and infrastructure. And we have, and talking about weak institutions, the 5th game changer is transforming the public sector architecture. So we've covered everything, and within the context of weak institutions. The plan, so that's the focus. That's where we want to mobilize funds.
Yeah. That's
where we prioritize our actions. But then with plans also, we want to be comprehensive. Mm-hmm. So we have 5 enablers: economic diversity and growth, governance and accountability, climate change, and economic environmental resilience. So gender mainstreaming. That came in last. That's why I hesitated a bit. It was 4 enablers. And the last one, of course, is financing. Yeah. Financing the risk. So coming back to now these are all, we see them as a nexus.
Yes.
They're all interrelated around the flagship program. So if I was doing a presentation, if you look at it visually, it's a triangle, or refer to it as a triangle or a pyramid. And in the triangle, you've got the circle in the middle, which is Feed Sierra Leone. Mm-hmm. Because if the intervention for Feed Sierra Leone is meant to turn the economy around, it's right. Commercializing agriculture,
right,
and using that as the engine for growth.
Right.
Now you have now each of them feed into one another, but the focus of all needs to be Feed Sierra Leone. Mm-hmm. So even if we're doing infrastructure, technology,
it's for a purpose.
It has to focus on, like within our budget, it focuses on the economic agricultural zones.
Right.
Then, of course, the effect of agriculture, food security on human capital development, mm-hmm. the development of the individual, and vice versa, their input into the sector. Then you take the youth employment scheme for the 500,000 jobs. You can get jobs in technology. Of course, the main focus of the jobs is supposed to be in agriculture. Mm-hmm. Then you've got the tech book feeding into the youth. So all of them are interrelated in this the nexus or the pyramid, the pyramid. Now, how it becomes a pyramid is the base is whereas as the Minister of Public Affairs described it, the 4 that I just mentioned are mm-hmm. the pillars. And then the transforming of the public sector architecture, that is like the foundation.
That's the base, the foundation, yeah.
And we have a lot of, I have to moderate a lot of arguments as well as the president, because every single minister feels that their area is the most important. Oh, you can't do this with the technology. Oh,
welcome to the World Bank. Yes.
You can't do this without that. But then the president says, feed saloon is the priority.
Yeah.
But then on the foundation, they would say to you, well, you can't do anything because the transforming of the public sector architecture is for delivery.
Right.
And they say, well, if we don't have delivery, we don't have your nurses delivering, you don't have your extension workers delivering, if we don't have proper e-governance and everything else that makes cuts down the bureaucracy and makes the delivery more efficient, then you can't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
So we're the most important. So anyway, we work on all of these, and then there's a further breakdown. For instance, in feed saloon, and I'm looking at the time, I'll see when I'll cut off. That's why I think for feed saloon, we deal with agriculture,
right?
Okay, the production, but we're also dealing with fisheries and commercializing the fishery sector as well,
right?
Yeah, and then we've got nutrition. Those are the three main areas. But for human capital development, we've got education, we've got health, we've got the social protection, we've got the water, we've got children, aged, and almost everything in the social sector. For the jobs, what we did was, when it was being developed, I think some of the objectives that came in were mainly youth empowerment, not youth employment. Yeah, okay. I think I'll just get to the 5 and then in the next round. So, but why I'm pointing this out is that when we were discussing, I said, but we're looking just at employment. How do we deliver those 500,000 jobs? And so we had to looked at the sector, saw how many jobs each of the sector, technology, agriculture, fisheries would produce. We have some sort of a schema with that. So that's where we were, okay, technology, 65,000 jobs. Then we saw that it gave the impression, or people felt that it was the public sector that was to provide all
those jobs.
Obviously, the public sector can't provide all those jobs. So what we did was we did a projection and division with 30% for the public sector, and then 70% for the private sector. So with the economy turning around, we expect the private sector to produce all these jobs, and then we have to do a breakdown within all of that. We come to technology, infrastructure, that's all the planning. And then I already mentioned the transforming the public sector architecture.
Yes.
I see you are indicating the time. So this is how we're going to do it. Yes. And we expect support from partners, from donors. I've been talking to, I think, both the World Bank and the World Bank that does donor conferences, the UNDP that does roundtables. I've been talking to both of them, and we see how we can mobilize funding, donor funding, and also private sector funding, et cetera, et cetera. So this is how we address the
wonderful
institutions.
Thank you so much, Minister. And I think that the lesson is that the way you tackle compounded challenges is by having solutions that are mutually reinforcing, right? Around some clear government priorities. Very interesting. Thanks, Susan. So we're going to switch continents. You've been working on Afghanistan for a number of years. And your project on community resilience and livelihoods will be the first one to go to the board of the World Bank since the government transition. Now, obviously, working at scale and providing essential services nationally to poor Afghans is no small feat at any point in time, but it's particularly difficult given the constraints that we're operating under in Afghanistan right now in the current political context. So maybe you can tell us a little bit how you're going about tackling this. Over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Renaud. And actually, in your opening remarks, all the issues you raised, I felt like you were discussing Afghanistan. You're describing it. It's an incredibly difficult situation to work in. There's no internationally recognized government right now. We have a dysfunctional financial system. Half the country is acutely food insecure, and there are severe restrictions on women, okay, as many of you have read. It's also a country that's deeply affected by natural disasters and climate change. I think it ranks fourth in the world in terms of most vulnerable countries for climate change and other risks. Okay, so there's an amalgam, a supermarket of challenges that our development agencies are working with. Never mind the FCB context. So I think the bank's strategy since the political transition in August 2021 was really about what we're talking about today, about these national platforms. Okay, how can we deliver impact at scale for the Afghan people? And, I think we've done it pretty well given the circumstances. Up to now, we've basically benefited over 60% of the Afghan population, despite all these challenges. Providing services on livelihoods, job creation, as the minister was mentioning, health, food security, education. And the project that I work on, Community Resilience and Livelihoods, and it's implemented by UNOPS. My UNOPS colleagues are here, supported by both the social sustainability and inclusion and the urban departments at the World Bank, and actually working with agriculture, water, and other ones to deliver together services in the country. It's supported by the Afghanistan Resilience Trust Fund. We're very lucky to have that trust fund of multi-donors there, as well as hopefully we'll receive IDA financing in the near future. So far, the project scaled up. When we started, it was intended to scale up rapidly. It's hit all 6 regions of the country, most of the provinces and cities in the country, and it's now benefiting, providing jobs, livelihood support for over 5.4 million Afghans. 5.4 million. And additionally, that 6.5 million Afghans receive better services, improved services in terms of, road rehabilitation, water and sanitation, flood, climate resilient activities, and so forth. But it's creating jobs. Okay. And remarkably, also 45,000 women, Afghan women, are receiving jobs through this program. Okay. Many people are surprised when I say that after what they read in the New York Times and other ones, but it is possible. It is possible to work in Afghanistan. It is possible to reach women and have development by and for women in Afghanistan. Okay, so we're now undertaking additional financing to scale the program up. And I think the key really is that these national service delivery platforms, be it in health, in livelihoods, in agriculture, and education, they're meant to basically address the multiple crises that we're talking about today, be it earthquakes, floods, as well as we're facing now a returnee crisis, a refugee crisis. 700,000 refugees are now coming back from Pakistan, and We're dealing with all of that. So if we have a platform in the country that can be flexible and reach people in adaptive management, then we've done it. Okay, and I think we've been able to do that working together on sustainable development across the various sectors. So I think, Renaud, you asked, how do we do that, right? Yes. I'm always struck by these FCV conversations we have because everyone talks about what we're trying to achieve. But I really think it's about how. Okay, I really think how are we going to get to those goals? And it's not easy in these contexts. So in our case, we were actually able to build upon 20 years of bank investment, okay, in the country, in local institutions called community development councils, in health service platforms that have been there. The bank invested heavily in the health service delivery system, NGOs, and also private sector. Okay, so that investment that the bank made for 20 years since 2003 remained there.
Right.
Okay, and that's critical. And in these countries where we have politically estranged governments, and that's an increasing scenario now, it's not an exception to the rule. Half the poor people in the world will be living in politically estranged situations. The bank needs to remain engaged. Mm-hmm. Okay, so how do we do that when we're in such difficult political environments and dealing with such major issues, right? And I think the answer to that, at least the answer in Afghanistan, was build on local institutions. Afghanistan
from the ground up, right?
Yeah, no, Afghanistan has, I don't believe in this lack of capability in these countries. Afghanistan has incredibly strong actors. Urban has worked on private sector development for years. They're building the private sector. We support over 4,000 suppliers there now, private sector, through this project. 4,000. Okay. I mean, we're working with health centers. We're working community development councils, 35,000 of them in the world, so in the country. So, there's things to build upon there. So when even after the transition, when the bank left for a while, we did some humanitarian aid, but then we came back. The health services right now are being delivered. 70% of the health services build upon those local institutions that the bank helped develop pre-2021. So I think that's really important to help build that, work through the third parties and build those local institutions for sustainability. And I also think that shows to millions of Afghan men and women this whole issue of remaining engaged, okay, that we're not abandoning them during the most difficult time. And I think that's the message we should send.
That's a very powerful message, Susan, and I think it will resonate with many of the panelists and the audience today. Another place where it was very difficult to operate for a long time was Iraq. And Harry, your team has written a very interesting piece on what happens post-war on land pollution in Iraq. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that is, and why it's important, and maybe what we can do about it? Over to you.
Thank you, Renaud, and thank you for picking up this point, because typically when you look at conflict countries, we look at social development issues, reconstruction programs, etc. But the conflict pollution is something I feel is generally taken a backseat. It gets an attention when the ongoing conflict is happening. You see a lot of destruction happening. But the post-conflict pollution that actually links up with the land pollution that Ajay was talking about, or the livelihood losses, or agriculture loss, or agriculture productivity that is lost, is all linked to the conflict pollution to a large extent. But unfortunately, the detailed analysis and assessment has not been done. So this is what we try to do in Iraq. In fact, the way we see it is that when the conflict happens, warring countries will destroy a lot of industrial assets, a lot of economic assets, which includes industries, power plants, depending on the country profile. Or sometimes, like in the case of Iraq, it is oil fields, oil wells, and oil refineries, etc. So the impact of this pollution is quite large. It doesn't restrict to one particular location. It spreads to large areas, and it also contaminates, like say, water bodies, natural resources, biodiversity areas, you name it, depending on the country profile. So that's something, if we are able to focus, typically donors, or even including to some extent or large extent in the World Bank, focuses on infrastructure development, reconstruction of towns and villages. These are important. Of course, these are very critical, but we tend to ignore this dimension of conflict pollution. And it also actually helps, if we are able to address this conflict pollution, it also helps return of IDPs, because all we call as livable cities or livable planet comes because unless you give a clean environment, which helps you generate jobs, helps you produce agricultural products, etc., it doesn't help. So that's what we try to do in Iraq. Just to give a few numbers, and very broad numbers, of course, a very detailed technical assessment that was done. But the whole idea was to bring out these economic and livelihood dimensions from the pollution angle, rather than looking at the very technical aspects of chemical pollution, which includes all kinds of contaminants, etc. So what we see here in Iraq, at least, is we did an assessment of about 700 sites and identified about 70 sites which are highly contaminated. The numbers that come out is that about 1.7 million people are affected because of these 70 sites. And the potential of remediating these sites would lead to about $1.7 billion a year, which is about 0.5% of GDP of Iraq.
And what is that land polluted by mostly?
It's in Iraq. It's mostly oil pollution and then chemical industries, because the country profile is broadly oil and chemical contamination. So when you remediate this, it's an annual basis. You get $1.7 billion to the GDP, which is quite substantial. It is about 0.5% to 1% of Iraq's GDP. And in terms of livelihood restoration, we see at least, again, another 50,000 jobs created on an annual basis, including about 30,000 of agriculture jobs. So this dimension is what we need to put it in, and then actually kind of integrate them back into the reconstruction programs, so that we are not only focused on social development and reconstruction objectives, which is very critical for a country that is coming out of FCV context, but we also build in this livability dimension, which is again our renewed vision for the World Bank. So that's the important.
Very interesting. Thanks so much, Harry. So our colleague Stefan is suffering from a power cut in Cairo, so he's lost the connection. But we will adjust. Oh, there he is. Stefan is back. Wonderful. Welcome back, Stefan. And we were hearing just before about Afghanistan, and Susan saying she's hoping that IDA will come in and support. You oversee our program in Djibouti and in Yemen, which benefit from IDA, and you were the director in charge of IDA in the past, so you know IDA very well. And it's a very important year for IDA because it's IDA 21 replenishment that is starting. IDA is the largest source of financing for fragile conflict countries. It's the largest source of climate finance and climate adaptation and resilience finance in the developing world. It's a vital source of concessional funding for so many countries around the world. And of course, it's a global tool. It's a tool that belongs to the overall community. But we're also hearing quite a bit about Yemen and Yemen's fragility and the armed conflict that seems to be expanding now and touching the Red Sea. We're hearing quite a bit about that on the news. But it'd be great to hear your perspective on the complex operating environment in Yemen and how our model and our focus on building institutions can best respond to this, and how can we still get results and development impact in such difficult contexts. Over to you.
Thanks, Renaud. Good to be with you all. I might speak a bit faster than usual, just by fear that the power gets cut again. So I will focus indeed on Yemen. Just to give a quick background to Yemen, we spoke about IGAD and Djibouti at the beginning of the session. Yemen is just on the other side of the strait. It was a very poor country when the conflict started almost 10 years ago, with close to 50% of the population in extreme poverty. In fact, with a decade almost of conflict, we estimate that income per capita has probably been halved, and extreme poverty is now probably around 75%. Inadequate food consumption is really a major concern at 50%, and it's been like that for that decade. As a result, the prevalence of stunting is probably one of the highest in the world at 50%. So 50% of an age group, it's a huge proportion, and we know how stunting in the initial years of childhood have a negative impact for the rest of their life. And Yemen is also one of only 5 countries in the world that is classified both as low income and experiencing absolute water scarcity. Water availability keeps decreasing and water needs keep increasing, and the combination of the conflict and climate change is making things worse. And as you said, the recent developments in the Red Sea are rather concerning, both with direct impact in the country, but also disruption in supply chain and most likely aid. So you introduced the session referring to the bank mission of a world free of poverty on a livable planet. Here we're clearly far from a country free of poverty on a livable planet. So that, to me, that's enough to make a compelling case, as was mentioned. I think Susan mentioned on Afghanistan, why it's so critical for partners to stay engaged. We must try and avoid a complete collapse of human capital of the Yemeni people, all the while preserving as much as possible some institutional capacity. So that's been the bank's strategy for Yemen since the beginning of the conflict, supporting people and institutions with a focus on basic service delivery, human capital, food security, livelihood opportunities. Really, the part of the FCV strategy on staying engaged at the core of the humanitarian development nexus. One of the key priorities within that has been food security. As I mentioned already, this has always been a challenge, and it's been worsened by war, inflation, and climate change. We have a project, for instance, the Emergency Social Protection Enhancement and COVID Response Project, which provide cash transfer for millions of vulnerable Yemenis, also providing employment opportunities and vocational training. In particular, with the recent developments in the neighborhood, we're really concerned on food security. And one of the key principles, in my view, of this work in staying engaged, as others have mentioned before, is to work in partnership with others. And on that front, we're very happy to be working together with the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, as well as a number of other humanitarian and development partners to prepare a joint monitoring report on food and nutrition security, because we've learned the hard way that you want to have early warning when food security gets even worse. Another key point of our engagement, of our approach of staying engaged, is to try to the extent possible to preserve local institutions. So, for instance, where our operational policy means that through UN agencies, not through directly financing the government, we're still able to channel resources and support existing institutions. And name a few, we are supporting the Social Fund for Development, the Public Works Project, the Small and Micro Enterprise Promotion Service. All this makes the delivery of IDA more efficient because we are relying on Yemeni know-how, but also it helps us maintain the capacity of some of those institutions, which will be very handy when the peace is around the corner. And Renaud, you know those mechanisms very well. You were actually working on that program when many of these mechanisms were set up. It's really not easy for us to stay engaged. It's frustrating to implement in this environment, but we believe it's so essential both to stay engaged and to keep engaging with local institutions. And then last point, since you asked about IDA, IDA obviously has been a unique tool for that strategy. We've delivered almost 4 billion in interventions since 2016, focused on this same very critical services that we're supporting, and all of that in collaboration with UN agencies. I think particularly important is that IDA provide a steady source of financing that is predictable, and that's in contrast to a lot of support to many countries like Yemen, and in particular Yemen, where the support is characterized by volatility and unfortunately in recent years by decline. IDA also provides the operational flexibility to adjust to the realities on the ground. And IDA is also, this engagement is also a way for us to unlock a lot of knowledge engagement with a lot of important pieces of analysis on poverty, the financial sector, the water sector, growth prospects. So IDA is really a unique platform, not to work just on our own, but actually to mobilize and collaborate around that platform. And most recently, we are very proud to have augmented the IDA program with a new Yemen Trust Fund that has already accepted contribution from the UK and the Netherlands, and we will be seeking more partners. So, as you said, this is the year where IDA needs to replenish, and I think Yemen is one of those countries where we demonstrate the power of IDA, and I hope there are many champions of IDA in the audience that will pick that up. So, in bottom line, Yemen is really a testimony that if we want to leave no one behind, we can't leave any country behind. We simply cannot disengage. And our IDA program with so many partners is also a testimony that it's possible to deliver results in such a challenging environment. But Yemen is also a testimony that much more needs to be done for Yemeni people. Thanks, Renaud.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Stéphane. Really appreciate that. And it's nice to see that, the efforts we put in many years back to try and work with those local institutions are bearing fruit in the same way as Susan described it for Afghanistan, right? And Somalia is another situation like that, where, this is a long game, where if we stay engaged and work with the institutions, we build that capacity, it stays for the long term. And it's something that benefits countries. You mentioned champions of IDA. I will invite all of the champions of IDA and everybody else in the room to watch a little video about IDA now, which we will cue, and then we will take questions in the room if there are any.
Did you know that by 2030, more than half the world's poor people will live in fragile and conflict-affected situations? That's millions of already vulnerable people caught in the intersection of another major challenge. Enter IDA, the World Bank's International Development Association. IDA is the arm of the World Bank that provides grants and low-interest loans for the poorest countries, including fragile and conflict-affected situations. When crisis hits, IDA makes it possible to focus on immediate humanitarian needs while also tackling factors that drive fragility, conflict, and violence. And IDA has a strong track record of doing this. In Yemen, for example, IDA provided cash transfers which would become a lifeline to those in dire situations. IDA is working with the UN to strengthen health, nutrition, water, sanitation, and hygiene services. In Somalia, IDA is strengthening infrastructure and enhancing resilience in the face of frequent droughts. IDA also played a critical role in Somalia's recent milestone of debt relief. And in the Sahel, where climate change is making lands drier and less fertile, IDA is supporting herders and farmers in managing land and conflicts over access.
IDA can sprint in the face of an emergency while not losing sight of the long-distance race towards peace and prosperity. The intersection of natural hazards, climate change, food insecurity, and pandemics means that we need to redouble efforts towards resilience and preparedness in the most vulnerable countries. That's why the upcoming IDA 21 replenishment must be our most ambitious replenishment to date.
IDA also has a window for host communities and refugees. Working closely with partners, IDA helps countries create opportunities for refugees and their host communities.
The World Bank and IDA have been exceptionally at the forefront, emphasizing supporting host governments to include refugees in national systems. This has been done through real, meaningful, tangible action backed by significant financial resources, and specifically the $3.8 billion that have been made available to 17 refugee hosting countries around the world.
To find out more about how IDA works for FCV countries, visit ida.worldbank.org.
Thank you so much. So I think we got the message on IDA, but it's really about not leaving anyone behind, be it in Yemen, be it in the Horn of Africa, be it in West Africa, or indeed in Afghanistan or Iraq. That's what the Livable Planet promise is about. Let me take the 10 minutes we have left to see if there are questions. Yes, please. I see somebody here. We have a lady with the mic. And anybody else? In the back there, the lady, please. So please, gentlemen, over to you. If you could introduce yourself and ask your question, make it quite brief. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is John Weiss. I direct a youth apprenticeship, teaching teenagers how to build things, and it's an entrepreneurship program. And I was curious about the gentleman from Yemen mentioned vocational training, and also Susan mentioned creating jobs in Afghanistan. But I'm curious, how are there plans for preparing young people for those jobs so they have the skills and the competencies?
Very good question. And I think the minister who could also respond to that, given the focus on creating 500,000 jobs. And let's take the question from the lady in the back as well, and then we'll group the two.
Thank you. That was quick. My name is Marianne Caballero, Senior Public Sector Specialist for the World Bank. I wanted to talk a bit about it's been fascinating to hear all these results, but also about the way exactly of how we get these results. So we know that in politically strange, fragile countries, it's hard to work with the central government, or just impossible, no? But we also certainly know that there is no prosperity or future if there isn't a functioning central government. So certainly we want to manage the risks of our interventions and what they do for the actual capabilities in the future of these central governments to move forward. So I guess the question is, how are we managing that risk? And specifically, often enough, we tend to create parallel structures, as we know very well, massive project implementation units that often enough, in a base case scenario, in a mild one, will suck up the capacities of the government because they pay more, etc. But in the worst case scenarios, they can also turn into a transactional relationship with the government, whereby the PIU needs to pay essentially the civil servants for them to do very important work. So I want to know how are we dealing with these risks? How are we trying to get better at managing these risks? And I am particularly interested in hearing from Excellency, because I'm sure that at some point in Sierra Leone, you might have dealt with this risk with this approach, or maybe right now in this moment, or maybe in the past, that was something that was a preoccupation for your government. So I'd love to hear your views as well on the matter. Thank you.
Very good. Two very good questions. Let me check if there is any third one. If not, we will go with these. So let's start with the question on preparing young people, in particular, for the job market, right, and vocational training. Maybe Susan, you can start on that, and then we'll go to the minister and Stéphane.
Sure. No, thank you very much for the question. It's hugely important in Afghanistan, and majority of people are under 16 years old. So it's something that we really need to work on. And ironically, on the additional financing we're putting forward now for the board in a month or so, we've created a new activity, basically working with women's economic activities. That's a prominent part of our engagement there. And a lot of that does involve working with young women to get them ready, right? Unfortunately, a lot of the restrictions are such that women actually do a lot more in home production and activities, but we're able to then help them do things at home, to small businesses, basically home production activities, just to make sure that they are involved in the economy, frankly. So a lot of that is put there as a very good question. And I think that's something the bank should be paying more attention to in a lot of these FCB countries.
Very good. Minister, those 500,000 jobs, it's not just the supply that needs to be created, there's also the demand, right? So you also need to make sure that the skills are there.
Yes, it is an integral part of the program and that particular component. And also in relation to women, because I don't know if it's the same in the countries you're working in, but the focus usually is on jobs for men.
Right.
And in Sierra Leone, and I pointed it out, youth seem to be synonymous with young men.
Right.
Completely. And, I went to a village once and I was undertaking a survey and I had to deal with three groups of people: men, women, and youth. And I found out that in the youth group, we only had men. So I said, don't you have any young women, under the age of, what was the age we were taking? I think under the age of, it was 18 at the time, or a little bit older than 18. And they said, no, once they're married, and most of the women were married by that age, they're no longer youth. So we tend to ignore the women. So we're trying to make a deliberate effort to make sure that young women are included in these training programs.
Excellent. Stéphane, anything you want to add from the Yemen perspective?
Just maybe a quick point too. We indeed have some of those interventions, and we have some good organizations that pre-existed the conflict that are making the connection between vocational training and actual jobs. What I see the more pressing and really impossible question is there's very limited resources in Yemen, and our IDA envelope is also limited. And so in a context where you have so limited resources, how do you establish priorities? You unfortunately cannot work along the whole line of the education system from basic education to vocational training. And so that's one of the challenges. How do you find interventions that have the most cost-effective impact given the very limited resources at our disposal?
Yes, that's a common challenge across all of these FCV settings for sure. Finally, let's tackle the question of the lady in the back. Very interesting question about how, yes, you need to work with local institutions when the central government is either very weak or estranged, right, from the international community. But how do you avoid bypassing it completely, right? Because over time, we will need a central government to collect taxes, to pay civil servants, to take over the basic functions of government. Sierra Leone has actually gone through that transition following the war. There were a lot of PIUs, but then eventually, the government institutions started to strengthen. I don't know, Minister, if you want to tell us a little bit how you saw that journey evolving in the case of Sierra Leone, and then maybe anybody else who wants to complement, and then we'll wrap up in 4 minutes.
Yes, I mentioned in a former panel that usually you have the donors coming in with consultants short term. After the 3, 4, 5 years, they leave. The project collapses. But what is happening more we're in Sierra Leone, and probably because we were a little bit more mature, the donors or the partners now are supporting the government institutions and strengthening government institution right down to the local level. So we have less of the bypassing of these sort of institutions.
So that's a transition.
Yes, yeah. And we have strong coordination now with the partners, with the NGOs, civil society. NGOs are registered in our ministry, actually. And then we also are the ministry that coordinates the DPAC. So there's a lot going on with coordination and connecting with the community level. We even have development committees at the district level that comprises of government functionaries, local government functionaries, NGOs, and civil societies. So it's much stronger now.
Very interesting. Yeah. And yes, Hart, we go ahead, and then we'll conclude there probably.
I just thought just add, because we are just working on after the work, we are developing a project of 20 million. We have the same problem. So it's a concept that we all know, but applied in a slightly different way, learning by doing. So rather than, typically in FCV context, we get a UN agency or somebody who will implement the project on behalf of the government. Instead, what we are trying to do is UN agency will be hired by a government, whatever government, in this case, government of Iraq. So in a way, they work not as a consultant, but a partner agency to work with the government. So the skills, what we see in UN agencies actually implementing the program, be it is fiduciary, technical, and institutional capacity, will be built by working together with the government. So this is a model which we are trying slightly differently in Iraq. But otherwise, in Lebanon, we have a program which is UN is hired. And so it's basically completely dovetailed to UN agencies. Then the capacity will never be built. So there's no one easy answer, but this is one option we are trying in Iraq, and hopefully it works.
Very good. So I think that's all we have time for, unfortunately. But as we close out, I want to maybe share a few reflections. One is that we started with the compounding effect of climate change, food insecurity, fragility, conflict, how it all comes together. But what we also came out of this discussion with is the sense that, that does not mean that we should just despair and give up. We can stay engaged. We can work with the local communities. We can build those institutions that will come in handy when the political situation or the security situation stabilizes. And we have been doing that. We have been doing that in Yemen, in Somalia, in Afghanistan, in many other places. And we are reaping the rewards of that in a way. Today, that's a really important message. The other important message is the need for partners to come together. We cannot work alone in these environments. We need our UN partners. We also need to coordinate at the regional level, like we were just saying, and we need to try and see if we can use the comparative advantages to really try and stay the course and respond to the urgent, but keep our eye on the important, on the medium term trajectory of development and the creation of that livable planet that we all hope for. So with that, let me thank our panelists very much. Please let's put our hands together to thank them. And I hope that you have a wonderful time at the Fragility Forum and that you'll have other opportunities to engage informally after the panel. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm John. Hi. We have been based in Los Angeles or San Francisco.
Thanks for that.